In a warehouse, a sniper with a rifle poised waits.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise.
Now, you're John Lennon on... Yes, that's right. What do you do in the group, John? I play harmonica, rhythm, guitar.
The 60s. How did a single decade move the needle so far and in so many directions at once? Historian Dr. Terry H. Anderson aptly characterized this decade as an endless parade of political and cultural protests, a period marked by seismic societal shifts.
Peace in Vietnam was the basis for the London March, but many other causes and ideals were given an airing by their young champions.
From the Vietnam War to the British invasion, Woodstock to the Civil Rights Movement, and then JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassinations, the 60s stand out as a pivotal era, a time of unparalleled transformation, reshaped the fabric of Western society in ways that still reverberate to this day. It was an era of upheaval, when the status quo was challenged on multiple fronts, socially, culturally, and politically. Marginalized voices rose up against entrenched power structures. We had the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, anti-Vietnam War protests, all became rallying cries for change.
Use your brains, not your bodies.
For those who think that the women's liberation movement is a joke, may I disabuse you of that notion. It is about equal pay and equal opportunity in the job market.
And then the counterculture phenomenon, the hippie movement, questioned traditional values and championed peace and communal living. And then we had the backdrop of Cold War tensions, but the 60s also witnessed unprecedented advancements in technology and space exploration. The Apollo 11 mission's iconic moon landing symbolized not only human ingenuity, but possibly hope and progress on a global scale.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And creativity, wow. Talk about a decade. I think of the music genres and arts and the mark they left on the cultural landscape.
What's your real appeal to their fans, do you think?
I think the appeal is mainly the same as any other pop artist. It's just they like the way you look and they like the way you sound. That's all there is to it.
Rock and roll icons like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones redefined popular music. Folk legends such as Bob Dylan and Joan Baez use their art as a platform for social commentary. Motown brought soulful rhythms to the mainstream. And then there was psychedelic rock pushing the boundaries of musical expression with its experimental sounds and imagery. Together, these musical movements reflected the spirit of rebellion and change that defined this era. At the heart of the 60s culture beats the charisma and clairvoyance of my guest today, Prince Stash. Prince Stash is someone who lived the 60s and survived, and today he still thrives because of social media and his ability to captivate and inspire new generations.
I can't tell you how endearing Bob Dylan was. Dylan cornered me and talked to me endlessly. You know, he talked at me. You couldn't get a word in edgewise. And his mind was just popping all over the place.
He performed and worked and hung out with various bands, including the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Vince Gill and the Playboys, David Bowie, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and so many more who defined the swinging 60s in London, Rome, Paris, and Los Angeles. He's made him famous for his rest with the Rolling Stones founder, Brian Jones, his engagement to Italian superstar Romina Power, and for being a fashion icon launching the new romantic look that was all the rage well into the 70s. And he comes from a line of notoriety and nobility. And these are his stories.
This is Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Prince Stash, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
I'm honored to be your guest, Tony.
We're going to spend some time unpacking the 60s. We're going to talk a lot about the lessons in life you're giving the world today. And the first question I have for you is, do you think that all you've lived, and we're going to really understand that when I say all you've lived, has led you to this point in life where you are somewhat a modern-day philosopher, a modern-day Socrates that's just trying to compress the complexities of the world into these wonderful thoughts that you bring up?
A lot of things have come through what I term inner standing. During the introspection brought about by the so-called pandemic and, the hysterical reaction of all governance, one's normal life was completely perturbed. And it brought about my writing for an English publication, retrospective, an article about the absolute elsewhereness of being. My secret philosophy, as I call it, is based on twin pillars. One is the innate faculty of inner standing as opposed to understanding. And the other thing, which was also brought about by people having found their way into mystical, magical dimensions through what? Through psychedelic drugs. They suddenly saw the ego as a major stumbling block. So what did they decide? Oh, you have to be ego-less. Nonsense. It's ego freedom. That ego freedom means you can have a Ferrari at the door, a racing Ferrari, but the ego freedom allows you to get in the car, drive it, and park it. Whereas the human condition is so convinced about that one has totally forgotten one's true origins or what one is at the core of one's being. And so they either want to shoot the car to be egoless, which leads to tremendous psychic trauma and a complete collapse of the whole scaffolding of one's being, or they want to drive it into the bedroom because the driver and the car, in other words, the driver and the vehicle, are so identified that the driver's forgotten that he can step out of the car. That's the position of ego freedom.
So, Stash, just because I think it's so important for the audience, because you arrived at that point, but just prior to that, I love your lineage, which you talked about earlier. Part of your lineage is also your parents. I mean, your father was one of the most famous artists at the time, Battus. He was, I think, the only living artist of his day to be in the Louvre. Your mom was an aristocrat. You talk about, in several interviews, this sort of fusion of energy that happened in your home. Just share with us a little bit about the young Prince Stash before you become sort of part of the epicenter of that sort of swinging 60s.
When I was born during World War II, pretty dark time, in October of 1942, and I was born in Switzerland instead of being born in Paris, where my parents had lived. They had left it just in time. So I was born in Switzerland and lived in these truly, truly exceptional circumstances made it that we lived in those absolutely splendid estates like Villa Diodati, where Lord Byron had leased in 1816, where Mary Shelley conceived of Frankenstein and so on, which was absolutely extraordinary. You're dealing with a childhood of another age. It's inconceivable in the 21st century to have lived. There were servants, cooks, maids, etc. Those people had children. We played with the children, but we had nannies. We didn't have the kind of, my brother and I, we didn't have the kind of childhood that people have in the late 20th and the 21st century. There were many degrees of separation between the adult world and the children's world. One's parents had completely separate lives. My father was not very often present. He would appear at that stage. My parents were separated. Of course, we didn't know anything about these things because we never witnessed any cross words or anything being exchanged. It just so happened. And the amusing thing was my mother was very beautiful and was a great femme fatale, as my father would say. And she was an extraordinary person. And my father said with a great deal of affection in the last year of his life, you know how I found out that your mother had a lover? Because she put a letter to her lover and a letter to me in the wrong envelopes, and sent both letters to the wrong parties. And that's how I discovered. And my father, rather than being angry and wanting to shoot anybody, was tender towards my mother. And throughout her life, despite them being with different partners, those two had a complicity, a link that was so profound that it was never dissolved until my mother died.
I love this when you take us into your father's studio and explain as a young child what it meant when because his studio was out of bounds, and he would invite you in on occasion, and you said, my chest would just explode. Interesting for someone that wasn't that often in your life.
I remember being in my father's studio as a child, but that was at the French castle of Chassis. And my father was living in this amazing place, medieval castle with, basically my father was trading in those days. He never had any significant amount of money because everything that he produced, which ended up being worth absolute fortunes, was an exchange. So a small syndicate, those people would come and really fight over those works, and was because he was never, until perhaps the last 12 years of his life, he was incapable of associating his own work with money. He said that if he thought about it, it would prevent him from working.
Part of what I garnered from listening to you was, and almost like your dad was sort of anti-establishment, didn't want to connect the monetization. I love when you talk first about being in boarding school, and instead of being, you wanted to be a rebel without a cause. And then even when you left and started to become on your own journey, instead of hanging out with the aristocrats, which you certainly could have, you chose to hang out with sort of the bohemian lifestyle that was happening in Paris with the jazz musicians and such. So
that was because I went to boarding school at a very early age. It was a very severe environment. There was a lot of corporal punishment and things like that. I fell in with a tutor. And this tutor was said almost as soon as he got to know me, he said, look here, I'm unqualified to really teach you the curriculum, but I will, if you give me a chance and don't blow the whistle on me, I will teach you things you will never forget. And that was my first introduction to the true classic, to a classic education and to philosophy. And finally, I ended up in a school where I was supposed to finish my studies. It was my last year of high school, and an American school in Rome. That's when I was discovered by someone who was Luchino Visconti's assistant. And he managed to persuade my mother to okay my trying for this film test, etc., and signing a contract, which didn't really lead to much per se in actual fact, but it completely liberated me into a world of show business where I was suddenly flirting with Ava Gardner, seeing King Farouk, seeing all kinds of people at 17 years of age, having a very interesting Dolce Vita introduction, and then going to Paris, being a tireless explorer of the night and being up, going to all the jazz club, and there were lots of African-American musicians and artists and dancers like Harold Nicholas, and actors, and those people were really, really interesting. And Miles Davis was there, he recorded for Louis Malle, Ascenseur pour l'échafaud, and there was this sense of that music didn't have to be very strict structure. Thelonious Monk would say, there's not one wrong note on the piano. It was a fabulous time, but they were not the only ones. There was so many people on the street. You would meet people like Man Ray. I dated Daniel Gobert, was the star of two of Marcel Carné's films, and that's how I met Kenneth Anger, the underground filmmaker who was a Crowley disciple, etc., etc. It was just an extraordinary time. And then I worked with the film director Marc Allégret, who had gone with André Gide to the Congo. I was both his actor and his assistant. He provided me with a letter of introduction to Sam Goldwyn Jr. And when I finally went to America in 1962, I went from New York to California on a Greyhound bus. I called up Sam Goldwyn's office, and the secretary put me through to him right away. And he said, "Can you come tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.? So I did, and it put me in a connection which would not be available to anyone, be it the richest billionaire son today, because there's a pecking order, and barriers in Hollywood are such that you cannot speak to above-the-line people, whereas I was able to completely, on Billy Wilder's set of Irma la Douce, it was I was an honored guest and so on. So I learned a lot of things about film-making techniques. I learned so much from a variety of people, a succession of people. And then I went back to Paris and couldn't find anything interesting to do. That's when my old friend, Vince Taylor, who I'd met 2 years previous to that, approximately, he sort of suggested that I join. You've always been in the music. Why don't you join the band? And so I joined the band as a percussion player, and soon became what he called his $1 million gimmick, because I was the one who pushed the band from a black leather rocking type of thing to a mod type of. Vince Taylor suddenly had a ponytail and looked more like PJ Proby than he ever, and he started writing in a certain style. So I had a lot of, and I had the hair and the long hair and the, modeled myself on the English singer Sandy Shaw. A stripper in Paris introduced me. I saw her wearing something that I'd never seen before, which was glitter. And she said, "Oh, chérie, do you want some? I'll give you some," etc. And so I wore it on stage, which, when we played against the Rolling Stones, we were not opening for them, as people normally would term it. We were what they called in France vedettes américaines, which was that in those days there were shows where one or two people would play one song, 2 songs max, and move on to another act, to another act, to another act. There was even a magician in the middle of it. Then we came on and we played our full set. Then there was an intermission and the Stones had to come against that. So many of their girl fans that followed us, we had such a tremendous success with them. This was a series of concerts. It was not just one gig. This was the whole Easter weekend of 1965. And as we came off, Mick Jagger very tartly said to Vince Taylor, "Oh, you've been on like that." And Vince said, "No, we've been rehearsing," and brushed straight past him without stopping. Whereas Brian Jones, the Stones were in the wings looking at us like that. They were like watching every move we made because, let's face it, Vince Taylor had been a huge star before they had started. And, with a huge star, I mean, he had panned a brand new Cadillac, which they, oddly enough, had not been a major hit as it should have been because it was put on the B side of the record when it was first released.
So you were part of the whole, because to me, Vince at the beginning was very Elvis, James Dean, leather jacket, the slick hair. And I did see him move much more into what I call more to that British invasion. You were his Merlin to the throne, kind of encouraging the band to sort of find that identity?
Yes, because the style, the idea of this avant-garde thing, I started the black leather, one black leather glove, actually for the reason that I'd hurt my hand. I was covering the bandages, but then it became stylish to wear a ring over the black glove and then to have it on all the time. And it was during the 65 tour of Spain that one actually became a sex object. Instead of chasing the girls would be chasing one, and you'd have ravishing models coming up to you and saying, salaciously saying, well, what are you doing after your show? And, you would play it, you would on purpose play it coy and say, what do you have in mind? And, and you would drive them crazy because they would try to touch you and you would go, don't touch me, it'd be sort of playing this kind of bisexual sort of game with them, which was very funny. And of course, one never slept alone, and those times were very heady times.
I was always fascinated about Brian Jones versus Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and the early Rolling Stones, and you were right in the middle of it. So I'd love you to just share a couple of stories about your relationship with Jones, his relationship with Jagger and Richards, and how that all tragically ended.
I'm glad you're asking this because there's a lot of misconceptions because people telescope timelines and forget that Brian Jones it wasn't, some people go to the other extreme, say he recruited everybody. Well, no, he put an ad and eventually there was another band called Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, which had Mick, Keith, and Dick Taylor. Dick Taylor, who then became the lead guitarist for the Pretty Things. They were a unit with, I think it was Mick Avery. They changed drummers many times before Charlie joined. And in that formation, Brian had a small and unsuccessful formation, and two formations got together. He was the only adult, so he was before Andrew Oldham came in with Eric Easton. Eric Easton is the real villain in the story, and Andrew Oldham always gets the blame. Brian did everything. He called people. He was very intelligent, and he was the only one who had complete understanding of music. He was a great musician. His parents had been classically trained and so on. So he knew he had perfect pitch. Everyone was in awe of him in the band, and that's one thing that people don't realize. What did happen is that Brian, as soon as they started to get a measure of fame, he was living with his girlfriend in Windsor at her parents' house, which was very cushy. Whereas Mick and Keith had moved with Andrew Oldham into an apartment, and Andrew, to his eternal credit, was the one who said, well, they can't go on doing covers of obscure R&B records, that nobody knows and that seem to be original material, but they have to come up with their own stuff. So he had the stroke of genius of making Mick and Keith start writing songs. People say, well, why didn't they ask Brian Jones? Geography, my dear fellow. Geography, everyone forgets that. Brian Jones had no intention of sharing these rather uncomfortable digs. He was in this organizing position of getting gigs and so on. He had a special deal. He got a little bit more money, which seems insignificant today. But in bands, people resent that sort of thing.
I think it was an extra £5 he took a week or something, right? For his
seems like nothing, but £5 when people made, it was a very good salary to make £15 a week. That was an amazing amount of money. Drivers worked very hard, got 15 quid a week. A secretary made £12 a week. It was, you have to put things in proportion. They just went in different ways. Of course, 3 people who lived together are closer, but it's ridiculous to imagine that Brian was ostracized. What happens in English, especially in English bands of those days, is that there's a lot of teasing going around, what is called in English slang winding up. So this winding up, this constant teasing of one another was at work there. And when they were on tour, in their first tours, etc., there was that kind of attention. But it was very minor. In the studio, I was at countless times in the studio with Brian Jones. I can tell you, these accounts that are so distorted, there are ridiculous stories that they played tricks upon him in the studio, which is Phil May, the late Phil May, the lead singer of the Pretty Things, had some completely fantastic stories, which I don't know how people invent these things and then persuade themselves that this actually happened. He had a story which made lots of waves among the fans of Brian Jones, most of whom weren't even born when he died, and let's be clear on that. These sort of people think that they believe, not knowing that it was absolutely impossible in those days, that he was told on a session for Little Red Rooster to only play certain things and that, as if you could reserve the studio. I mean, money was so tight in those days that it was impossible. Plus, you couldn't do it was very difficult to do overdubs. Even the Beatles in 1967, I played with them and I know how it went in the studio. You had to reduce things to 1 track, and by then you had 4 tracks. But when you only had 2, I can tell you it was a real challenge.
When we return, Prince Stash delves further into his unbelievable life. What a world. One that includes Jim Morrison, experiencing David Bowie's rise to fame, and even a phone call from Paul McCartney, who told him to come live with him in order to keep Prince Stash out of jail.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman, host of Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. A big shout out to First Up with RBCX Music that promotes emerging Canadian artists. They provide a platform for these artists to perform, to find new fans through media exposure, and access industry experts and mentors. RBC is enabling Canadian talent to continue to hone their craft, progress their careers, and follow their passions. Supporting Canadian artists matters to RBC.
You might have noticed this painting of Brian Jones up there. It was presented to me by members of the Brian Jones fan club of Rome. They brought it in great ceremony. Who painted it, I have no idea. I've never elucidated who it was. Nothing you can say about this other than that.
You're listening to Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Today, my special guest is Prince Stash. I first discovered him on Instagram as he was sharing some of his photographs and memories and his time alongside some of the biggest stars in history. But he was never starstruck. He was an important part of the conversation and the culture that'll be remembered forever. That relationship with Brian Jones, and obviously one of the things that's the arrest of Jagger, the arrest of Richards and Jones, you were part of that. I love what you had to say, that this was really a statement of the establishment paralyzed with fear that this counterculture movement, the power that they relished and held on to, was evaporating. And this was sort of their way of trying to fight back. So take us to that time in history where long hair and fashion and protests created such a level of uncomfort with establishment that they were willing to go out of their way to treat you almost like you were in a third world country in terms of fabricating charges and doing anything they could to sort of censor what you were all about.
Yes, and that brings us to something that is completely incredible from a modern perspective. When people are able to have piercings and, rainbow hair without raising an eyebrow, you see many customs officers, many police officers having earrings and things like that. In the days just where having a little bit of longish hair, an earring was considered so revolutionary, everyone was immediately hostile, especially the male population. People were thinking that something was assaulting their identity. The public at large, I'm talking about, sensed it as a threat, which made all of us bind very closely together, because we said, okay, we're a bunch of freaks, so we're going to stick together. That's how these very deep friendships were forged between people, all these different bands. We saw each other constantly because there was this outer hostility anytime that you went anywhere. People looked askance at how you dressed, how your hair was, and that kind of thing. In America, it was even worse. In America, they came at you. We had to persuade some strong-armed people to come to be our kind of voluntary bodyguards in America in 1965, for instance. And the Rolling Stones had a very hard time in those days. What is hard to believe is that they couldn't distinguish one person from the other. Oh, this is one of the Rolling Stones, they would say. They didn't know who people were, what their name was mostly. And they just thought, those guys have a very, there's drugs, there's all this sort of thing, much more. It was all exaggerated. And the Rolling Stones were obviously perceived as a threat to the establishment. So there was this famous incident where Brian shot off his mouth to people. The press heard it. They thought it was Mick for some stupid reason. They wrote it that it was Mick Jagger, and Mick sued the newspaper. So they took their revenge by having an inside guy. I mean, the whole story is very unclear, and we could spend hours talking about it. But the infamous Redlands bust happened then. And, after all, what did they find? Virtually nothing. So in the wake of the Redlands bust, the Stones were supposed to come up on trial. There was a tour of Europe. And during the tour of Europe, they came to Rome. I was in Rome. I went to see Brian, and the Stones were so happy to see me that I went with them to the gig at the Palazzo dello Sport in Leuve, in this Mussolini-built part of Rome. And then we spent the night, we were invited at the Piper Club, and that's when these photographs with Brian and I. And then we went to Villa Medici, which was my father's official residence as the head of the French Academy in Rome. And my father was away, and we ended up spending the night partying there. Brian said, "Oh, you're going to America. Why don't you stay with me and use my car and driver when you come to London?" And that's how I was getting money that was due to me before going to Hollywood to do a film. There was a planned feature film where my fiancée, Romina Power, and myself were supposed to be the stars of it. And it was called A Walk with Love and Death. And we would have been much better than the cast that he finally had to replace us with because of the infamous bust that occurred. Brian Jones, he wanted to reconquer his former girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, who is now with Keith Richards. And I had known her. She'd been a casual girlfriend of mine a long time before she had even met the Rolling Stones. And one thing that is never in her biography, or that she never talked about, was that she was with me when she met the Stones for the very first time, months before she hooked up with Brian in Germany. You know, they had this tumultuous relationship. She was the star of a Volker Schlendorf film called in English A Degree of Murder. At that stage, he showed me letters that she had written to him during this famous trip to Morocco where he'd fallen ill in France. And Keith and Anita had an affair, and Brian Jones, told me, well, I handled the whole thing. It was a complete mess. He then made me read every one of those letters that Anita wrote every single day, even though she was having an affair with Keith, to him. So she was torn between two lovers. He handled it completely wrong, lost her in Morocco. Keith took her away, and now he's accused of having done, they abandoned Brian. But Brian himself concurred. He handled everything so wrong that it could have led to a much more serious situation. Somebody could have been killed in that particular instance. So the best part of valor was for them to go away. By now, Anita was officially with Keith, but he asks me, "Do you think I can get her back?" And I said, I don't see why not. That got me into a situation where he then insisted that I postpone my own plans to go to Hollywood forthwith and accompany him to Cannes. When I said that I couldn't do it, he said, "In that case, I'm not going," which led the production and the director and everybody to actually call me and beg me to go. So finally I went with Brian, and the reunion didn't happen, but the extraordinary thing was they really were able to leave things in a far better order. Brian and I, and during the time we were in Cannes, Keith Richards was incredibly gentlemanly, because he didn't, knowing that Brian would be there and that there might be difficulties between them and awkward feelings, he stayed away from the premiere. And so we spent the night together with Anita and Brian. And when it became clear that it was that she wouldn't go back to him, it was left on a much, much better footing than before. And then we went back to London. When we were back in London is when this appalling bit of business occurred. Maybe 30 to 40 times the phone rang. We took turns answering it, and it was reporters that some of them we knew, asking all the same question, have you been busted? Which was absurd because somebody had brought the newspapers and Mick and Keith were on the front page being tried at Chichester that very same day. So we thought this can't be, me. And we wondered, what the hell? Could they have tried to come and we were asleep? And basically, that's when that raid did happen. I spare you the details, which I've gone over so many times. But what did happen was that what is worth repeating is that the press, especially the TV and all media, had been told about it to the point that when the police finally gained entrance and presented a warrant to search the premises for drugs, when we were arrested and taken to the Chelsea police station, across the street was a camera crew filming the whole event. When we were at Chelsea police station, during what you would call the arraignment, I suppose, they read the charges and then somebody bailed us out from the Stones office. And then with the advice of the police, Brian's Rolls came to the front door and was surrounded by 50 or more reporters, photographers. And we skipped out the back, jumped into a black cab and went to the London Hilton, where in the penthouse suite was Alan Klein, who'd come to help Mick and Keith. And as a direct result of that, a couple of days later, it took Alan Klein's major tantrum with the Hilton, who wanted to kick us out. They didn't want us to stay there. Everybody was flipped out, drugs and there was nothing. They'd found zero. It was completely trumped up charges. It was just planted stuff.
But you lost your passport and your ability to do that film.
Exactly. And so I was in dire straits. But Paul McCartney rang the hotel room. I said, Brian's out. He said, I'm not calling Brian, I'm calling you. He said, I want you to pack your bags. I'm sending a car. You're coming to live with me because they're going to try it again. And if they want to try it again, let me be arrested with you and we'll see what happens then. He was very sanguine about the whole thing. And so I went to live with Paul McCartney for quite a long time. Jane Asher at the time was away. It was very interesting because Linda Eastman comes into the picture just at that time, as a casual girlfriend for Paul. It was with Paul's support and that the Beatles took me under their wing. I spent a lot of time with them, socially and in the studio. It was an extraordinary silver lining to an otherwise very nasty situation.
I have a question about the Beatles because I've obviously watched a lot of their journey as well. And I heard something recently, I think Ringo Starr actually said it, if it wasn't for Paul McCartney, we might have made 3 albums. But McCartney was the guy that was driven, a perfectionist. He forced us back in the studio time and time again. Is that fair to say that incredible body of work that they produced in 8 years, a lot of credit has to go to Paul being, like you almost called Jones before, the adults in the room?
It was this extraordinary symbiotic relationship between Paul and John, how they worked, how they gelled, and George Martin behind the scenes. George Martin was always ready to, he immediately, I arrived at the studio, he said, get in there, and send somebody to mic me up and all that. And, because he was ready for anything that they might request, he would then facilitate. But Paul had all those extraordinary ideas. And Paul would always say, let's reduce everything to one track and then, bounce it all to one track and then start again and so on and so forth. it was fascinating.
And Linda Eastman, McCartney wanted, I believe, her dad to be the new manager. Was that the beginning of the end when they started the business side of they went from being these kids that grew up and evolved with the musicality I don't think we'll ever witness again, how far they went in such a short time. But was it the business of doing business, you think, that caused a lot of the friction in the brand, or was it girlfriends? I mean, there's so much.
I tried. I had this, although I'd been treated extremely well by Alan Klein personally, I saw a lot of things that had happened, which I didn't like with Klein, and I was correct in my perception that he could be financially quite tricky. I tried to tell the Beatles not to sign with Klein, but they were so shocked. They were saying, I remember George Harrison coming to me and saying, then why don't the Stones leave Klein if what you're saying is true, And they still went with Klein and had occasion to regret that. Naturally, Paul didn't want to go with Klein and wanted to stick with Eastman. And that caused a rift. But, by then, there was this fraying of those relationships, I
also want to talk to you about 101 Cromwell, because there's a time, very similar year, I think it was Laurel Canyon, where a neighborhood in LA where these musicians all found themselves. Neil Young was there, Mom and the Papas. Just an eclectic group of musicians. They came, Jackson Browne, and they helped to define that music scene in each other. And the way you talk about Cromwell was a very similar place.
It's a complete fallacy, the Laurel Canyon thing.
Okay.
Because are you familiar with the topography of Laurel Canyon?
No.
I had in 1965, the summer of 65, I had a house on St. Ives Drive, which is above Sunset at Doheny, leased a large estate which became the headquarters for that whole scene they refer to. Every band used to come over to my house, including Hell's Angels. Everybody was getting together at a place called Ben Frank's on Sunset. I'm talking about 1965, which is the first time that there's a hippie scene, but mostly constituted out of artists. It's people from the bands like Love, the Turtles, the Grassroots, the Birds. There's maybe 200-300 of us who are long-haired freaks. Most people are artists. Most people are musicians. There's a few black men like the Chambers brothers, Arthur Lee from Love. In Laurel Canyon, there are people living there. I knew Frank Zappa when he was totally unknown. When we went from Ben Frank's, driven away by police interference, etc., we decided to move our nightly headquarters from Ben Frank's to Cantor's on Fairfax Avenue. The so-called Laurel Canyon thing. Laurel Canyon, very few, people visited each other, but, it's not the Village in New York.
So let's take me to Cromwell, because you talk about that apartment building was an interesting place to be.
Well, the apartment building was a bunch of artists and counterculture people like Nigel and Jenny Lesmore Gordon had this apartment at 101 Cromwell Road. There was quite a bit of possibilities of scoring dough there. So it became very well known. And the whole building, upstairs from this main apartment on that Nigel and Jenny, different people were Chris Case, who worked for Robert Fraser. Different people lived together there. And then upstairs, Pink Floyd lived there. And, they were unknown. I, for one, loved their name. And I became friends with Syd Barrett at that time. And then when they were a bit more famous, at the end of 1967, there was this famous, with this group of people from 101 Cromwell Road, we went to the Black Mountains in Wales and had this extraordinary trip where, at the end of which Syd Barrett, part of his consciousness was left in this other dimension.
It's interesting. So Syd Barrett, another parallel to me, Brian Jones, both, I think, unappreciated for how much talent they had. Vince Taylor went, and yet all three of them really left a lot of what they had on the table when they went through substance abuse or just not. Even Jim Morrison, you talk about not dealing with celebrity, not like trying to understand who their identity was. To me, I thought there was pretty interesting parallels that there's some of the founders of these bands, maybe with the exception of Morrison, don't get the credit they deserve.
Well, Morrison was a much more interesting lyricist, and he was a powerful vocalist, etc. But he was so indulgent. When in 1970 I met Morrison, as I said in this video, he wasn't that. He didn't really interest me as a person. I was far more interested in his written output because he was a genuine poet. And what he wanted to be was a kind of Parisian poet a la Arthur Rimbaud, that was his romantic vision of things. He wasn't really interested in being a rock star at the end, Morrison.
I want to talk about Bowie because I love what you had to say about David Bowie in terms of his theater, his wit, his humor. But the fact that actually he sort of discovered you and you discovered him through against Vince Taylor.
Yeah. I mean, what he never said, but because David was also another one of those people who convinced himself of, we talked about these things, but David, very conveniently, when he talked to Vince Taylor, he made up the story of meeting him and looking at maps, etc. But what he never said was that in 1965, when Vince Taylor went crazy, literally, and was out of his mind, and, our band broke up because Vince Taylor started smashing up all the equipment, like the Who avant la lettre, and which had the organizers of the concert, which was meant to be trampoline to this major British invasion type of, we were meant to go backed by Joe Barbera's money on this big tour of America. And it was only a matter of showing what we could do that would have secured the deal. In the face of this absurd performance of his, where after the third or fourth number, Vince Taylor made it impossible for us to continue and walked off, he managed to persuade his brother-in-law that it was us who were responsible, and that, he had this diabolical ability that some people with what used to be termed schizophrenia, where he was able to convince people and to be completely reasonable. And we couldn't get him any help. And instead, he got all this money from his brother-in-law and marched off to England, where he proceeded to demolish very swanky Belgravia apartment. Well, I happened to go, and the doors were sawn in half, and there was a conspiracy theory running around the walls, this bizarre sort of stuff. And Vince Taylor himself looked grandiose with his hair in a ponytail, this sort of white robes, and then he was like a sort of mad, beautiful, mad prophet. He was followed by these beautiful, adoring girls, and one guy one young man, and that young man was the future David Bowie.
David Jones in those days, right?
David Jones, yes. David Jones, who observed and then, used, as he puts it, but he didn't say how closely tied to Vince Taylor he was at one point. No wonder he was able to come up with this Ziggy Stardust, because Vince Taylor was like a dynamo of ideas. Vince Taylor had written this, what I considered an absolutely absurd list of possible names of band. And I remember my rejecting this list in disgust. And it was so prophetic that all these San Francisco bands ended up being called things like that, Chairman and the Board, those type of names. He had thought of them. He was a sort of mad prophet.
Bowie he said that a lot of inspiration for Ziggy Stardust came from that moment when Vince kind of left the real world and the musician world and tried to, almost reposition himself as this modern day prophet.
The real story is this. Before we were supposed to do the Locomotive showcase concerts, I didn't have my passport. I had a bit of misfortune in that year, because I had tried to have my passport renewed. And there was an outstanding warrant for my arrest from the French army because allegedly I hadn't reported for the draft, whereas everything there had been a mix-up in the paperwork. But be that as it may, I'd been condemned to a year in jail. And Clive Donner, who was the director of a film called What's New, Pussycat, in those days, the working hours were very lax, and we would all meet at Castell's, the nightclub in Rue Princesse in Paris, and with Peter O'Toole, and we'd stay up all night partying and so on. And Clive Donner said, "Stash, I've written a cameo straight for you. Come to the studio tomorrow. You'll really thank me. This is amazing. I've written it." And stupidly, I thought, I'll kill two birds with one stone. I'll go to the Préfecture de Police, get my passport renewed, and then go to the studio, because you were supposed to be there by noon, 12:30, and then went there. Instead of this thing being facilitated, they made me wait. There was a very uneasy moment. Then the gendarmerie showed up, and I was arrested, marched off, through a series of very unpleasant things, and managed to bribe one of my guards and get him to call Donald Camel, the future director of performance, who then called my mother, called my father, and at least there was some ray of hope. So I was taken to a disciplinary regime instead of being able to be at the studio and doing this marvelous cameo. I was driven from place to place all day long, signing documents and then going on. We arrived at night in Fontainebleau in a disciplinary regiment where they dumped me with my long hair, my earring and everything. And, there was all these people who'd been arrested for various offenses who were in this dorm. And I thought, these guys are going to kill me. Instead, when the lights went out, little flashlights came on, and these kids, all these tough kids who, for disciplinary reasons, were in that disciplinary regimen, they all came, "Oh, not you! Man, they're going to cut your hair!" And they all were fans from magazines and so on. And they were like my bed piled up with all these offerings, it was the sweetest thing. And so that encouraged me the next day. I went up to the commander of that disciplinary regiment, very fine-looking officer, and I said, "Look, my father, this and that, and shouldn't have happened." And the man said, "Go and get a haircut, put on uniform, and we'll talk about it afterwards." So I was crestfallen. When my guard said, "What did the commander say?" I thought, I've got nothing to lose. He said, "Take me to the infirmary." So they took me to the infirmary, where the commander of the infirmary said, "Look, I can protect you, but do not move 1 foot out of this building." And so Vince Taylor came up and offered that we would play a free concert for the troops, but they had to release me immediately. And the captain from the infirmary sort of said, "I'm sending you for a psychiatric evaluation. I'm sure you'll get off," When I went for that, I really laid it on thick, with the psychiatrist, and they discharged me with an X5. Now, if you're completely insane, and foaming at the mouth, there's no X6. X5 was like you're a sociopath, a psychopath, and somebody who cannot be used, but at least it did the job.
Make sure you come back for part 2. Because Stash meets Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan.
There was this extraordinary constellation of stars and people around Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan was this bizarre creature,
He offers us some incredible lessons on love, his ideas on logic.
A very dear friend of mine, this great sage, said, "Love is not something you can fall into, nor is it something you can make a mess of."
The 60s versus today, and so much more Stash to stash away in the history of time. I hope you're loving this interview with Prince Stash as much as I am. In fact, he was there, alive, part of the culture, part of the conversation, and that he has such incredible insights into life.
Chatter That Matters has been a presentation of RBC.
Lots more to come. It's Tony Chapman. You're listening to Chatter That Matters.